If you have diabetes or your blood sugar spikes after eating sweets, stop what you are doing right now. Because what I am about to share with you about chocolate could completely change how you think about blood sugar and food forever. I need you to stay with me for just a moment because here is something most people with diabetes are never told. One type of chocolate has a glycemic impact that can be worse than certain processed breakfast cereals. Another type has been studied for improving how your body responds to insulin, reducing inflammation, and supporting the health of your blood vessels. Same food category, completely different effect inside your body. And most people with diabetes never learn this difference. In fact, there's a very high chance that the chocolate sitting in your kitchen right now, the one you bought because it seemed like the safer option, is doing the exact opposite of what you think. So before you take another bite of chocolate today, I want you to notice something. Think about the last time you had a sweet. Did you feel tired afterward? Shaky? Hungry again within an hour? Maybe a little foggy? Maybe you looked at your glucose monitor and felt frustrated wondering what just happened. That is not random. That is your biology responding to a specific type of food in a very specific way. And once you understand what is actually happening inside your body when you eat different types of chocolate, food becomes far less confusing and far less scary. Because here's the truth: the problem was never chocolate itself, it was choosing the wrong type. And today, I am going to walk you through the 5 types of chocolate that people with diabetes eat most often. I will show you which ones quietly make insulin resistance worse, which ones are far safer than most people realize, and the one form of dark chocolate that researchers keep returning to in metabolic health study after study. Stay with me, because the number one option surprises almost everyone who hears it. I am Dr. Megan Foster, and for years I have worked with patients who were told one very simple thing about chocolate: avoid it completely. And I understand why that advice exists. Chocolate is sweet. Sweetness raises blood sugar. So the logic seems obvious. But that advice misses something critically important. Because not all chocolate is the same. Not even close. The difference comes down to a few key things: how much actual cocoa is in the product, the specific protective compounds found in cocoa called flavonoids, what kind of sweeteners are used, how the body processes the food, what it does to inflammation over time, and how it affects the way insulin works in your body. When you ignore these factors, when you treat all chocolate as one single food, you end up either avoiding something that could genuinely support your health, or worse, eating something that harms it while believing you made a safe choice. That mainstream advice of just avoiding all chocolate missed something important. And today, we are going to fix that. Let me take you back for a moment. Think back to when you were younger, maybe in your 20s or 30s. You could have a piece of dessert after dinner and not think twice about it. Your energy stayed steady. You were not staring at a glucose monitor an hour later, wondering what went wrong. Now, a small sweet can sometimes leave you exhausted, unusually thirsty, mentally foggy, hungry again far too soon, or anxious about what it is doing to your numbers. And many people with diabetes reach a point where they assume their body simply cannot handle sweet foods anymore. That enjoyment and blood sugar management cannot coexist. But that is not actually what is happening. Your body did not suddenly become incapable of handling food. What changed is that certain foods, the highly processed ones full of refined sugar and very little else, trigger a dramatic and fast response in your blood sugar that a healthier metabolism used to manage more easily. That is not a life sentence. That is a biological reaction to a specific type of ingredient. And when you change the ingredient, you often change the reaction. Here is the good news: this does not mean you have to fear chocolate for the rest of your life. And it does not mean every sweet food affects your body the same way. Because once you understand how chocolate truly interacts with blood sugar, insulin, inflammation, and how satisfied you feel after eating it, you realize something important. Certain forms of chocolate do not behave like candy. They behave like a completely different metabolic experience. And that is where everything changes. Let me show you what I mean in the simplest possible way. Imagine your bloodstream as a highway. Your goal is steady, flowing traffic. Not gridlock, not chaos, just smooth, manageable movement. Now imagine eating a highly processed chocolate bar, the kind loaded with refined sugar, very little actual cocoa, and a long list of additives. What happens? Glucose floods that highway all at once. Traffic jams, insulin has to surge to manage the overload, your energy spikes and then crashes, and almost immediately your body starts signaling that it wants more. Because the crash feels like starvation to your brain. That cycle is exhausting. It is also damaging over time when it repeats day after day. Now imagine eating a high cocoa dark chocolate, something with 85% cocoa or higher minimal sugar and the natural compounds cocoa contains. What happens? The fiber, the natural fats, and the cocoa compounds slow everything down. Glucose enters the bloodstream gradually. Insulin does not have to work as hard. Energy stays more stable. The craving cycle does not get triggered the same way. Same category of food, different traffic pattern inside your body. That difference matters enormously when you are managing insulin resistance. Now, I want to show you the research behind this because this is not just theory. Scientists have spent years studying the compounds found in cocoa, particularly the flavonoids, and what they do inside the body. In multiple long term studies, higher intake of cocoa flavonoids has been associated with real, measurable improvements in how well blood vessels function, how sensitive the body is to insulin, the level of inflammatory markers in the blood, and the flexibility of blood vessels over time. Some studies showed meaningful improvements within just a few weeks of consistent intake. And now, and I want to be very clear about this, that does not mean candy bars are health food. That does not mean you can eat chocolate without paying attention to portion size or what else is in it. But it does show something incredibly important. The body responds very differently depending on what type of chocolate you consume. And that brings us to the five major types, because some are dramatically worse than others. And the last two are where things get very interesting. Before we get into the list, I want to briefly cover something that most chocolate conversations never address. And it matters more than almost anything else we will discuss today. The cocoa bean itself is one of the most mineral rich foods found in nature. It contains significant amounts of magnesium, iron, zinc, and manganese. And here is why that matters specifically for people managing diabetes. Magnesium plays a direct role in how your body processes glucose. It is involved in over 300 biochemical reactions in the human body, and several of those reactions are directly tied to how insulin works at the cellular level. Research has consistently shown that people with type 2 diabetes tend to have lower magnesium levels than people without the condition. And low magnesium makes insulin resistance worse, not better. So when you eat a form of chocolate that actually contains real high quality cocoa, you are not just managing sugar intake. You are potentially supporting one of the key minerals your body uses to manage blood sugar in the first place. This is a dimension of the chocolate conversation that almost never gets mentioned. And it is one of the most important reasons why dismissing all chocolate equally makes no nutritional sense. Zinc is another mineral found in cocoa that plays a role in how insulin is stored and released from the pancreas. The pancreas uses zinc to package and preserve insulin before releasing it into the bloodstream. When zinc levels are consistently low, that process becomes less efficient. And iron, while most commonly associated with energy and fatigue, also affects metabolic function in ways that continue to be studied. People with chronically low iron levels tend to show impaired glucose metabolism and reduced physical stamina. And physical activity is one of the most powerful natural tools for improving blood sugar control. The point is this: High quality, high cocoa chocolate carries a real mineral profile that is almost entirely absent in the processed low cocoa versions. And that mineral profile directly supports the systems that diabetes stresses most. Now, with that foundation in place, let us go through the five types. Number five is milk chocolate. Most people think chocolate is chocolate. They assume that as long as they limit the amount, the type does not matter much. That assumption is one of the most common mistakes I see. Milk chocolate typically contains somewhere between 10 and 30% cocoa, sometimes even less. The rest is sugar, milk solids, and additives. The cocoa, the part that carries any mineral or flavonoid benefit, is barely present. What you are mostly eating is sugar, and your body responds accordingly. The glycemic index of standard milk chocolate sits high enough that many nutrition researchers place it alongside white bread, certain crackers, and some processed breakfast cereals. There is also the satiety problem. Because milk chocolate is high in sugar and low in the fiber and natural compounds of real cocoa, it does not satisfy you the way a higher cocoa option does. You eat it, your blood sugar spikes, it drops, and the craving restarts almost immediately. Something else worth knowing. Most commercial milk chocolate contains an emulsifier called lecithin, used to create a smooth, consistent texture. Emulsifiers in small amounts are not considered dangerous, but some research has suggested that certain emulsifiers used regularly over time may affect the gut lining. And as we will discuss shortly, the health of your gut has a direct and meaningful connection to how your body manages blood sugar. So, the additives in processed chocolate are not entirely irrelevant from a metabolic standpoint. For anyone managing diabetes or insulin resistance, milk chocolate is the form that offers the least benefit and the most risk. But the next category is where things get even more surprising. Number four is white chocolate. Many people assume white chocolate is a lighter or safer option. They see the word chocolate and think it must at least have some of the compounds we discussed. It does not. None at all. White chocolate contains zero cocoa solids. What it contains is cocoa butter, the fat extracted from the cocoa bean, along with sugar, milk solids, and flavoring. Cocoa butter by itself has no flavonoids, no fiber, and none of the minerals we just discussed. None of the compounds that make high cocoa chocolate worth studying are present in white chocolate. From a metabolic perspective, white chocolate is a high fat, high sugar product with no meaningful cocoa content. Blood sugar wise, white chocolate behaves similarly to milk chocolate, a rapid glucose rise with no buffering from fiber or protective compounds. And because of the high fat combined with high sugar content, it can delay how quickly food leaves your stomach in a way that creates unpredictable glucose patterns in some people with diabetes. Rather than a clean, predictable rise, you may get a delayed and drawn out response that is harder to anticipate and manage. There is genuinely no research supporting white chocolate as a metabolically beneficial food for people with diabetes. There's no good reason to choose it over other options once you understand what it actually contains. The next category starts to shift the conversation considerably. Number three is dark chocolate in the 50 to 65% cocoa range. When people decide they want a healthier chocolate, they often reach for something labeled dark chocolate and feel good about the choice. And to a point, they should. But the cocoa percentage matters enormously. A dark chocolate in this range is better than milk chocolate. There is more actual cocoa present, which means more fiber, more natural fat, and some of the flavonoids we discussed. The blood sugar response is somewhat lower because the sugar content is reduced. But in this range, the sugar content is still significant, often 15 to 25 grams per serving. For someone actively managing diabetes, that is still enough to produce a meaningful blood sugar response, especially without careful portion management. The research on this cocoa range is mixed. Some studies show modest improvements in certain markers. Others show minimal effect because the flavonoid content is still too diluted by processing and added sugar. Here is something practical worth knowing. If you have ever eaten a piece of dark chocolate in this range and still felt a noticeable crash afterward, there is a specific reason. At this cocoa level, sugar is still the dominant ingredient. The cocoa is present, but not in high enough concentration to meaningfully slow the glucose response on its own. That said, for someone just beginning to shift away from highly processed sweets, this range can be a practical stepping stone. Think of it as a bridge, useful to cross, but not the destination. The next category is where the real shift begins. Number two is dark chocolate in the 70 to 85% cocoa range. This is the range where the science starts to become genuinely compelling. In this cocoa range, the sugar content drops significantly, typically between 5 and 12 grams of sugar per serving. The cocoa content is now high enough that the flavonoids, fiber, and natural fats begin to have a meaningful effect on how the food behaves in your body. The fiber slows digestion. The natural fats further slow the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream. The flavonoids begin to interact with the lining of your blood vessels and with the pathways your body uses to respond to insulin. Many people find that a small square of 75 or 80% dark chocolate after a balanced meal produces very little impact on their glucose levels compared to other sweet foods. But here's the part I find most compelling from a clinical standpoint. In this range, we also begin to see measurable effects on something called endothelial function. The endothelium is the thin layer of cells lining the inside of every blood vessel in your body. It controls how well those vessels expand and contract, how efficiently blood flows through them, and whether inflammation begins to build up inside the vessel walls. In diabetes, the endothelium is under significant stress. High blood sugar directly damages those cells, and that damage over years is one of the primary pathways through which diabetes leads to complications in the kidneys, the eyes, the nerves, and the heart. Several studies have shown that the compounds in high cocoa chocolate can measurably improve how that endothelial layer functions. Blood vessels become more responsive, blood flow improves, inflammatory signals that drive vessel damage begin to decrease. This is not a minor footnote. This is relevant to every major complication that people with diabetes are most afraid of. We are now entering the heavy hitters, the forms of chocolate that completely change this conversation. And this is usually the point where people realize they were blaming the wrong thing all along. Many people notice something surprising within just a few days of replacing a processed sweet with a small portion of high cocoa dark chocolate after a meal. Fewer cravings in the afternoon and evening, more stable energy that does not peak and crash, less of that heavy, tired feeling after eating, and fewer dramatic swings in glucose. That roller coaster hunger, where you eat something, feel briefly satisfied, and then want more an hour later, starts to calm down naturally. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in the context of diabetes and food choices, and that is the role of your gut. Your digestive system is home to trillions of bacteria. They actively influence how your body processes glucose, how much inflammation you carry, how your appetite signals work, and how well your cells respond to insulin. This community of bacteria is called your gut microbiome, and its health has a direct connection to your metabolic health. Here is what is fascinating about high cocoa chocolate in this context. The fiber in cocoa, a type called prebiotic fiber, feeds the beneficial bacteria in your gut. When those bacteria break down this fiber, they produce compounds called short chain fatty acids. These compounds reduce inflammation throughout the body, help maintain the integrity of the gut lining, and appear to play a meaningful role in improving how cells respond to insulin over time. This is a very different conversation from simply whether chocolate raises blood sugar. This is about the long term systemic effects of consistently feeding your gut bacteria with the right materials. The highly processed low cocoa chocolates we discussed do not provide this prebiotic fiber, and the emulsifiers in those products have been studied for potential negative effects on the gut microbiome. So the comparison is not neutral versus beneficial. In some respects, it may be actively harmful versus genuinely beneficial. This gut connection also helps explain why many people who switch to higher cocoa chocolate over several weeks report feeling better in more general ways: less bloating, more consistent energy, better sleep, fewer afternoon slumps. These are all consistent with what happens when the gut microbiome shifts in a healthier direction. Now, if you try 85% dark chocolate for the first time and immediately dislike the bitterness, that is completely normal. Your palate has been adapted to much sweeter foods. The bitterness is actually the flavonoids, the very compounds responsible for the benefits we discussed. It is an acquired taste, and it does not mean this option is not right for you. Start slowly and combine with Greek yogurt, berries, or nuts to ease the transition. But the number one option may be the most powerful of all, because this is where chocolate stops behaving like a dessert and starts acting like a concentrated source of the metabolic compounds we have been discussing. Number one is pure cacao, also called raw cacao or cacao nibs. This is the cocoa bean itself, dried and broken into small pieces with minimal processing and no added sugar. You are getting the highest possible concentration of everything that makes this food interesting from a health perspective. Maximum flavonoids, maximum fiber, maximum minerals. And because there is virtually no added sugar and very little processing, the glycemic impact is minimal. A standard milk chocolate bar might have 30 to 40% sugar by weight. A 70% dark chocolate might have 20% sugar. Pure cacao nibs have virtually zero. The tiny amount of carbohydrate they contain is almost entirely fiber, which does not behave like sugar in your bloodstream. This is why researchers studying cocoa effects on insulin sensitivity, inflammatory markers, and blood vessel function consistently reach for the highest cacao forms in their study designs. The dose of active compounds is simply much higher, and the interference from sugar, which itself promotes inflammation and insulin resistance, is absent. Raw cacao powder is another powerful option in this category. It can be used to make a warm drink with unsweetened plant milk, a pinch of cinnamon, and a very small amount of stevia or erythritol. It can be added to smoothies. It can be used in baking as a substitute for standard cocoa powder. And here's a detail that almost never makes it onto the packaging but makes a real difference to your body. The standard alkalization process used on commercial cocoa powder, done to reduce bitterness and improve texture, destroys a significant portion of the flavonoids. So, a hot chocolate made with regular processed cocoa powder does not carry the same active compounds as one made with raw cacao powder. The taste may be very similar. The metabolic effect is not. Now, cacao nibs are very bitter on their own. Most people cannot simply eat them plain, but you do not have to eat them that way. They can be added to Greek yogurt with a small drizzle of honey and some berries. They can be blended into a smoothie with banana, nut butter, and unsweetened almond milk. They can be mixed into oatmeal with cinnamon and walnuts. They can even be used in savory cooking, added to slow-cooked meat dishes or chili, where the bitterness becomes a rich, complex background flavor. This approach is actually rooted in centuries of culinary tradition from Central and South America, where cacao was used as a savory spice long before it was ever associated with sweet desserts. Now, let me talk about something that connects blood sugar to a factor most people never associate with food choices, and that is chronic stress and the hormone cortisol. When you are under stress, your body releases cortisol. Cortisol is a survival hormone. One of the ways it prepares your body for a perceived threat is by raising blood sugar so your muscles have fuel available. In a short term emergency, this makes sense. But when cortisol is elevated chronically because of ongoing work stress, financial pressure, sleep deprivation, or simply the daily weight of managing a chronic illness, it creates a persistent background elevation of blood sugar that has nothing to do with what you ate. This is something many people with diabetes experience without fully understanding. They will have a week where their numbers are harder to manage and they cannot figure out why. Their diet did not change significantly, but their stress level was higher. Or they slept poorly for several nights in a row. Here is where chocolate connects in a genuinely interesting way. High cacao dark chocolate and cacao products contain compounds ascorbate, including theobromine and a serotonin precursor, that have a mild calming effect on the nervous system. They do not dramatically alter mood, but several studies have shown that regular consumption of high cocoa chocolate is associated with meaningfully lower cortisol levels. One study gave participants 40 grams of dark chocolate every day for 2 weeks and measured cortisol and other stress markers before and after. The results showed a real reduction in both. And if elevated cortisol raises blood sugar independently of food intake, then anything that consistently reduces chronic cortisol is directly relevant to diabetes management. This is why the full picture of how chocolate affects your body is more complex than simply counting grams of sugar. The effect on stress hormones, gut bacteria, mineral levels, and inflammatory pathways are all part of the equation. Let us now talk about sleep specifically because the connection here is one that changes how many of my patients think about their numbers. Just 2 to 3 nights of disrupted sleep can measurably reduce insulin sensitivity. One study showed that after 4 nights of sleeping, only 5 hours instead of 8, healthy participants showed insulin sensitivity levels comparable to people with prediabetes. 4 nights. That is how fast the effect appears. Sleep deprivation raises cortisol, increases appetite hormones, elevates inflammatory markers, and disrupts how the liver manages glucose overnight. Now, cacao contains magnesium, and magnesium plays a significant role in sleep quality. It helps the nervous system settle down in the evening, supports the production of melatonin, which triggers sleepiness and reduces the kind of muscle tension and nighttime restlessness that disrupts deep sleep. Many people who are low in magnesium report difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up feeling truly rested. So, by eating high quality cacao products consistently, you may over time be supporting better sleep through improved magnesium levels, which supports better insulin sensitivity, which makes blood sugar management easier. It is not a single direct line from chocolate to better numbers. It is a network of connected systems, all pointing in the same direction. And these are the kinds of connections that never fit on a simple food restriction list, but explain why some patients who shift their habits report improvements that seem larger than any individual change would predict. Now, let me cover label reading in practical detail because this is a skill that changes everything once you develop it. When you pick up a dark chocolate bar, here is what actually matters. The cocoa percentage should be as high as possible, at minimum 70%, ideally 85 or above. The total sugar per serving in the nutrition facts panel should be under 12 to 15 grams for a product marketed as a health conscious choice. Anything higher deserves scrutiny. The ingredient list tells the full story. Cocoa or cacao should be the first ingredient. Sugar should appear lower on the list. If you see high fructose corn syrup, maltodextrin, partially hydrogenated oils, or artificial flavors, set it down. Watch out for sugar alcohols like maltitol in diabetic and sugar-free chocolates. Maltitol still raises blood sugar, not as sharply as regular sugar, but enough to matter. And in larger amounts, it causes significant digestive discomfort. It is not the safe pass that the packaging implies. Erythritol and stevia are among the better sweetener options, as both have minimal impact on blood glucose. But even with these, the total ingredient quality of the product matters. The phrase diabetic chocolate on the front of a package means nothing from a regulatory standpoint. It is marketing, not medicine. The label itself is the only reliable source of truth. Now, the brand question. Two bars, both labeled 75% dark chocolate, can vary considerably in their actual flavonoid content. High heat during processing destroys flavonoids. Brands that use lower temperature processing or that list the origin of their cocoa beans tend to preserve more of the beneficial compounds. Single origin chocolates, where the cocoa comes from one specific region, tend to have a more consistent and higher flavonoid content. You will often see the country or region listed on the packaging. This is a quality signal worth noticing. In general, a shorter and simpler ingredient list is the most reliable indicator of less processing. The fewer steps between the cocoa bean and the finished product, the more of the original compounds remain. Now, let me cover timing because when you eat chocolate matters more than most people expect. Eating high cocoa dark chocolate immediately after a balanced meal, one that included protein, fiber, and healthy fat, produces a very different glucose response than eating the same piece alone on an empty stomach. When there is already food being digested, everything slows down. The protein and fat from the meal further slow how quickly everything moves through your system. The result is a much more gradual and manageable glucose response. The specific composition of that meal matters too. A meal built around refined carbohydrates has already accelerated your blood sugar before the chocolate arrives. Adding chocolate after that is not the same as adding it after a meal that included vegetables, protein, and whole food fats. The meal sets the metabolic stage. When that stage is stable, even a modest piece of chocolate fits comfortably into it. And a 10 to 15-minute walk after eating, even a slow one, meaningfully improves post-meal glucose response. Your muscles are large glucose consumers. When they are lightly active, they pull glucose out of the bloodstream for fuel. Combining a small portion of high-quality dark chocolate after a balanced meal with a short walk afterward creates a compounding benefit that is greater than either change alone. Now, let me address what this all means for HbA1c, because this is the number that matters most to many people with diabetes. HbA1c measures your average blood sugar over the previous 2 to 3 months. It reflects your patterns, not a single meal or a single decision, but the cumulative result of hundreds of decisions made over weeks. No single food will dramatically transform your HbA1c on its own, but patterns are made of individual choices, and individual choices compound. If you consistently make choices over 30 days that result in more stable post-meal glucose responses, less spiking, less crashing, more steady traffic on that highway, then at the end of those 30 days, your average blood sugar is lower than it would have been. A lower sustained average over time means a lower HbA1c at your next blood draw. Research on cocoa flavonoids and HbA1c is still developing, but several preliminary studies have shown modest but real reductions in HbA1c among people with type 2 diabetes who consumed high flavonoid cocoa products consistently over 8 to 12 weeks. The reductions were not enormous, but they were real, and they occurred without changing anything else about the participants' diets or lifestyles. Combined with better sleep, reduced stress, more physical movement, and smarter food pairings, these effects compound in ways that become very visible over several months of consistent choices. There is one more area I want to cover before we close today, and it is something I rarely see discussed in any conversation about diabetes and food. And that is the difference between how your body handles chocolate in the morning versus in the evening. This might sound like a minor detail, but the timing of when you eat carbohydrates throughout the day actually matters quite a bit for people managing blood sugar. Your body's sensitivity to insulin is not constant throughout the day. It follows a pattern. Most people are most insulin sensitive in the morning, meaning that in the morning, a given amount of carbohydrates will produce a smaller blood sugar rise than the same amount eaten in the evening. This is tied to your body's natural daily rhythm, which regulates dozens of hormones in predictable cycles. As the day progresses, insulin sensitivity tends to decline. By the evening, particularly after 7 or 8 at night, many people are significantly less insulin sensitive than they were at breakfast. This means that the same small square of dark chocolate that barely moved your glucose after lunch might produce a more noticeable response if eaten late at night. This is not unique to chocolate. It applies to carbohydrates in general, but it is a practical piece of information that can make a real difference in how you experience the transition to higher cocoa options. If you are monitoring your glucose and you notice that your response to dark chocolate in the evening seems larger than you expected, try the same portion earlier in the day, after lunch rather than after dinner, and compare. Many people find the evening response is meaningfully higher, and that simply shifting the timing makes a significant practical difference. There is also something worth knowing about physical activity and its interaction with this timing pattern. Exercise, particularly anything that uses your large muscle groups, improves insulin sensitivity for hours afterward. A walk in the late afternoon or an early evening exercise session can meaningfully restore insulin sensitivity before dinner, effectively extending the window in which your body handles carbohydrates more efficiently. Combining a modest amount of high quality dark chocolate after dinner with an evening walk covers multiple mechanisms at once. The slower glucose response from the chocolate's fiber and fat content, plus the muscle driven glucose uptake from the walk. It is a simple combination that requires no special equipment and no dramatic lifestyle change, and the effect on post meal glucose is real. Let me also address something that comes up in almost every conversation I have with patients who are trying to make smarter food choices. And that is the question of how to handle social situations, birthdays, family gatherings, holidays, restaurants. These are the moments where dietary intention and real life come into tension with each other. And for people with diabetes, these situations can carry a specific kind of anxiety. The feeling that enjoying any part of the celebration means doing damage to your health. But here's what understanding actually gives you in those moments. When you know how chocolate and blood sugar interact, when you understand the mechanism rather than just following a list of rules, you can make real time decisions that are genuinely informed rather than driven by fear or guilt. At a birthday party, you might choose a small piece of the dark chocolate component of a dessert rather than a piece of something made entirely from refined sugar and white flour. You might eat it after a meal rather than on an empty stomach. You might take a brief walk afterward. None of this requires announcing your health choices to everyone at the table. None of it requires sitting out of the celebration. It is simply the application of knowledge in a real world setting. That kind of flexible, informed participation is far more sustainable over a lifetime than rigid restriction that eventually breaks under social pressure and leads to overcorrection in the other direction. I have had patients who avoided dessert completely at family events for years out of discipline and fear, and then one day ate an entire portion because the restriction had built up enough tension that willpower gave out. That pattern is common, and it is far more damaging to long term blood sugar management than the small, mindful choices that come from genuine understanding. Knowledge gives you options that rules alone never can. Now, I also want to address something practical about the transition period, the weeks between deciding to shift your chocolate choices and actually feeling different. For most people, the first week or two of moving toward higher cocoa options is the hardest. The Your taste buds are accustomed to a high level of sweetness. The higher cocoa chocolate may taste bitter or unsatisfying at first. Your cravings for sweeter foods may actually feel stronger before they begin to calm down because your brain notices the absence of the sugar it was used to. This is normal, it is temporary, and it does not mean the approach is not working. What is actually happening during this period is a recalibration. Your taste receptors are adjusting their threshold for sweetness. The bacteria in your gut that thrive on sugar are gradually being replaced by different species that do well on the prebiotic fiber in high cocoa cacao. Your insulin levels, which had been chronically elevated from repeated sugar spikes, begin to trend lower as the spikes become less frequent and less severe. None of these changes are visible to you in the first few days, but they are happening. And around the 2 to 3 week mark, most people begin to notice the shift. The higher cocoa chocolate starts to taste genuinely satisfying rather than just tolerable. The craving for processed sweets becomes less insistent. The energy after eating becomes more steady. The first 2 weeks are the investment. The weeks and months that follow are where the return on that investment shows up in how you feel, in your glucose numbers, and eventually in your lab results. One last thing I want to address today is the emotional dimension of food for people living with a chronic condition like diabetes. Food is not just fuel, it is memory, culture, comfort, celebration, and connection. The smell of chocolate is linked for many people to some of their most positive memories, childhood holidays, family kitchens, moments of comfort during difficult times. When a diagnosis makes those foods feel dangerous, there is a real loss that happens, not just of the food itself, but of what the food represented, the comfort it offered, the way it connected you to people and memories you love. That loss is real, and dismissing it with a simple list of restrictions does not make it disappear. It just adds guilt and isolation to an already difficult adjustment. What I hope this conversation has done today is begin to close that gap, not by pretending the food category is entirely safe in all its forms, but by showing you that the category contains real options. Options that are honest, informed, and that allow you to participate in one of life's genuine pleasures without doing damage to your health in the process. A small square of 85% dark chocolate after dinner, a smoothie made with raw cacao and banana, a warm cup of cacao powder, cinnamon, and unsweetened almond milk before bed. These are not consolation prizes. They are genuinely good choices that carry real biological support for the exact systems diabetes challenges most. You can enjoy food and manage this condition well. Those two things are not in opposition. They exist together in every patient I have ever seen who found a sustainable, long-term approach to their health. That approach always has the same foundation, not restriction, not fear, not a rigid list that breaks down under the first family dinner. Understanding, practical knowledge that follows you into every meal, every grocery store visit, every celebration, every quiet evening at home. That is what lasts. That is what actually works. And that is what I hope you carry with you today and every day after.